Bible Smack. So I have been focused for oh last year or two in studying apologetics focused on Jesus. And so, something I would like to do is having a Jesus-based apologetic evangelistic presentation. We finished the first segment, and um, this is not the presentation. These are the plans for the presentation, in hopes, God willing, that one day we can put this all out into a nice documentary movie. But anyhow, so the first video I made was talking about existential needs. The fact that life produces problems that need a hero. And we have a world that has, the God shaped hole in their heart. So when you look at some basic um, needs in our life, acceptance, justice, freedom, um, the assurance, and I think a couple others. When you see these guidance, when you see these needs and how this world is not fulfilling them, it seems that, if we have a world that has a need, then there has to be something that could supply that need. Otherwise, why would there be a need? Okay. Um, I need a doctor because I'm sick. I'm sick, meaning that I am not what I should be. Okay. I am not healthy. I know that I'm not healthy, so there must be a healthy to obtain. And so, since we have the question, we need the answer. And of course, I'm going to argue that Jesus is the answer to that problem. But we first start off with the need. Many times we start from a position of we don't need God in our lives, we don't need the Messiah. Now prove it to me. No, because you're not seeking truth. You have to seek truth and you have to have a need. So that's the first question is, do you have a need? Why do people who are struggling in life come to Jesus? Because they need the answer and he provides the answer. And the other answers of life do not provide that for other people. So now I want to take some time and we're going to focus on, was there really a historical Jesus? Is there a true person who physically walked this earth and was known as Jesus? Okay, so from the very beginning, we know that Jesus is reported to be a Jew and he was reported to have a name Jesus. That's the first clue. But Flavius Josephus records that Jesus was a common name. Um, there might be some variation of languages. So in Greek it would be Isu. The New Testament was written in Greek, and so it says Isu. And others have made a bigger deal about if people spoke in Aramaic, they would have said Yeshua. But in general, those are still understood to be Jesus. So there are reports of a man walking this earth named Jesus. We have 4 biographical stories of good news: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But many people contend against them, and they have made tons and tons and tons of accusations. The first problem with that is there's too many accusations. When you have a bunch of accusations that do not reconcile for a truth, there's a problem. So one minute, Jesus is not true because he's a figment of the imagination. Then he's not true because he's just a regular person. Then he's not true because he was a warlock. Or he's not true because the Jews don't think that way that Jesus thought. Well, these ideas don't amount to truth. So you don't have an authority over that. You just have speculation. And when you have a lot of speculation, what do you get? Well, you get the fact that if the world is right, then Jesus is wrong. But if Jesus is right, then the world is wrong. And as we stated in the last video, the world is wrong. But was there a real person named Jesus? That's the starting question. And, Richard Carrier, who denies the existence of Jesus, said that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. The problem is the humanity of Jesus, Jesus being a human, is not an extraordinary claim. Now, typically the way the answer goes is that there is popular scholarship with popular answers, and so they address the popular teaching. But popular teaching doesn't mean all teaching or all evidence. So I'm going to go through, and this is a unit in a book I wrote called But What is the Truth? It's called The Facts of the Gospel. Now, I'm not going to read this verbatim. It's a big volume. Also, I'm not going to focus on my sources because the sources are written down, and so I'm going to offer that to people to research for themselves, both my writing and the citations. You can find those as you read them on the document. However, I do want to cover these issues and make that cumulative case. Now, there is, I believe, a point of presuppositionalism because you have to know what you're arguing about. And I come to that from experiencing the Gospels in my life and the Gospels overcoming life's existential problems. From there, I began to research for the past 25 years. Okay, so essentially, this is a case I've made of me seeing a evidential worldview from my studies, even though I have a presuppositional base. You have to place faith or a presupposition whenever you operate. You have to have some deep down foundation. And so this is a case that I make to where if the case is strong enough, then you should consider this is your foundation. And Jesus is the place of faith. He is the object of our faith, and in general, the most evidential object of our faith. So that's what we're asking about. What correctly gives you the presuppositions? In this book, and then two others, one book that's meant to be the earliest, even though this was last written, but I address the earliest presuppositions in a blog book that I call The Fact of Creation, and now I address the presuppositions of faith, of a biblical faith in the gospel, in a blog book entitled But What is the Truth? And then the next one is a book that I have published called A New Look at an Old Word, where I go through and deal with the topic of the Bible and various criticisms, especially on the issue of text and translation. So, understand that. Now I'm going to go ahead and, give that case out roughly. All right, so the facts of the gospel. First thing to note is that when we're trying to talk about, Jesus' time in history, there was an event where the Roman Empire destroyed the capital city of Israel, known as Jerusalem. Israel was not a sovereign nation at this time, and the Romans would call it Palestine. But the Jews were recognized as living there, and people were at peace with their religion so long as they didn't upset the cart and deny the authority of Rome. One day, they felt like that contract had been null and void, and so they invaded the city of Jerusalem, slaughtering nearly 1 million people, burning down houses, and destroying to the ground the temple in Jerusalem, Herod's temple. And the problem is that the temple is a place where the Jews kept their records. So with the main library of the Hebrew people destroyed, much of the evidence was destroyed with it. And so this is kind of where the mythicists start to insert their ideas. That there was a tradition of myths for the sake of psychology and entertainment and politics that were created to basically make an ultimate movie for some young Jewish intellectuals, and that would involve the Gospels. The reality of Jesus, and at many times the apostles, just depending, was put in question. And the mythicists claim that there is, they're like old liberal Christians, they used to divide up Jesus between his historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. Now, in church history, this was called the heresy of Nestorianism. The idea that there were two Jesuses. But not appealing to orthodoxy, but to science as their orthodoxy. The liberal Christians have, set up that reality for such a long time that instead of siding with a historical Jesus, perhaps a forerunner to Marxism, they have instead the mythicists have sided with the Christ of faith. And this is very similar to Gnosticism. A Jesus who is not real, but is real in spirit. With mythicist atheists usually saying real in psychology. So, first thing that kind of seems a little bit strange with that theory is the fact that there were real historical messianic contenders. This is brought up in the book of Acts. Acts 5, verse 34, there stood up one in the council, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, and he was recorded in Jewish history as well. He had a reputation among all the people and commanded to put the apostles forth a little space, and said unto them, Ye men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what ye intend to do as touching these men. For before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain, and all as many as ye obeyed him were scattered, and brought to naught. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee, in the days of the taxing, and drew away much people after him. Also, he also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. And now I say unto you, refrain from these men, and let them alone. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught. But if it be of God, ye cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. And to him they agreed, and when they had called the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. All right, so I record many of these contenders for the Messiah. There was a total of around 30 contenders for the Messiah in the first century. So if you were a mythicist, why not take a real person and make myths out of them? There's another document I have somewhere. Let me see if I've got it on me, so I'm thinking as I go. But there is a book by an atheist, popular atheist. He made the case for Jesus existing, Bart Ehrman. And so Bart would argue that Jesus did exist, even though he thoroughly denies the reliability of the Gospels. He will admit to some historical coincidences, but nothing anywhere near reference to the divine. He thought that Jesus was a teacher. Well, when we look at this book, he mentions a passage in Acts chapter 9 referring to James, the brother of Jesus, by Paul. Paul was recognized as a historical figure because he authored 2/3 of the New Testament. And he said, I've offered. He basically said these are his letters. And even though there are liberal Christians who will deny some of the authorship of some of the books, nobody really denies the authorship of all the books. Because you have this a dangerous spiral where all history ends up going into question, and then you can't rely on any history, which then basically rips a hole into all of academia eventually. Nevertheless, he recognizes that James, the brother of Jesus, is real, and if James, the brother of Jesus, is real, why did everybody call him the brother of Jesus? So James is a big deal if we talk about the historicity of Jesus Christ. James authored a book out of the New Testament. James was spoken of many times in the book of Acts. He was also mentioned in the Gospels as one of the brothers that was in doubt of whether Jesus was the Messiah. However, he becomes the pastor of the Church of Christ in Jerusalem. The Christian church was, I use the word Christian a little bit later in Acts 11. But basically, the Messianic church was established in Jerusalem and headed by him until he was martyred. Flavius Josephus has a lot to say about James, the brother of Jesus. In fact, he speaks more about James than he speaks about Jesus. So, is there any reality to James? Well, there was a bone box found with the inscription of James, the brother of Jesus. And the Israeli archaeological authorities at first criticized it. Maybe not at first, but it was discovered, and many people made a big deal about it. I saw a presentation by a theologian named Ben Witherington going over its authenticity. Yet, the archaeological world backed off because the Israeli archaeological authorities denied it. But then there was a peer-reviewed paper on it, I believe it was in 2014, that talked about a veneer that was on the casket that proves it had gone through the aging and therefore was the bone box of James. So, since James, the brother of Jesus, has physical remains and is historically recorded, then we know that he existed. And if he existed, then it implies that Jesus existed. Now, there's another character that is ignored by Christian scholarship. And this character does have extra biblical evidence. However, some of this was assumed to be mythological for many years. And there are archaeological studies now that authenticate his identity outside of Scripture. Only nobody has really connected these dots that I know of except for myself. So there's a popular, well, I don't know if he's a popular Christian, but semi-popular British creationist named Malcolm Bowden. And I have been a fan of his YouTube channel. He's in advanced age. I don't even know if he's still alive at this point, but I communicated with him about my ideas if this could authenticate the existence of Christ versus the mythicist. And he thought that was a good idea and that I ought to pursue that study. I have since done some studies, although he referenced a book that I did not have access to until this year. This is called Albion Restored. Arthur and his wife Rosalind Edel wrote this book. They based it on some archaeological studies, and I think they found extra material over the years, but an Episcopalian churchman named the Reverend Harry Arden Lewis, basically he had done archaeological studies of ancient churches in Britain and in other parts of Europe. And so they were touched by his ministry and decided to not only go over his case, but to do research themselves and go deeper to find evidence that Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man because of his involvement as a merchant of tin in the ancient British Isles. These ancient isles are considered by the Greeks the Cassarites, which translates to the Tin Islands. The Jews in Hebrew would speak of the region as Tarshish. And Tarshish was the region of the British Islands, the coast of France, and the northern part of Spain. This was especially Somerset and Cornwall were the only places in that region of Europe, and I mean most all of Europe, maybe half. I think they mentioned one itty bitty, and I mean an itty bitty tin mine, but otherwise all of the tin would be coming out of those British Isles. And the ancient Syro-Phoenician Empire, modern archaeologists are now finding a lot of evidence of their time. They were the first seafarers that developed a network of sea trade. Okay, so they would trade with different countries. And this would lay the roots of the coming Roman Empire. So these Phoenicians would go across the world, but they loved to go to those 10 islands that we today call the British Isles. And why? Because tin was a very important ingredient in the making of the molten bronze of what we today call the Bronze Era. So this bronze had to have 10% of its makeup to be the element of tin. And the only good source of tin in the Mediterranean would be from Cornwall and Somerset in southeast England. So they had these ancient tin mines and tin miners. Now, in the book, Albion Restored, they go over first some ancient philosophers who also operated as historians. You know, basically, the ancient philosophers didn't just deal in one strict form of logic, they would also do the history in ancient versions of science. So, as they recorded there, and other ancient philosophers recorded these 10 islands and the British, we now know that this Syria Palestine area was a place where people would do a lot of the shipping. One of the famous ports was the port of Tyre. Tyre was a big city in the Syrian Phoenician area. And that the Syrian Phoenician area is on the northernmost tip of Israel. So the Assyrians came out of there. And generally, if you lived in northern Israel, that was the place to go, just like a New Jersey person going to work in New York City. It was just a really easy access type of place. Now we know in the Gospels that Joseph of Arimathea, we know he was a rich man. We don't exactly get very much of how he was a rich man, but we start to see little pieces of evidence. Let me see if I can start looking at my records here. Now, in a book called Christianity in England, there's a guy named Pals Mills Dolly who is thoroughly liberal in his Christianity. He's not out to put any agenda in that direction, and most Protestants don't know about this or care. They'd probably think it was, something too Catholic or something. Anyhow, he says this. He says, precisely how or when the first Christian community in Britain received its start is impossible to tell. A heroic missionary journey of the spread of the gospel to this western limit of the Roman Empire has been lost beyond recovery. Okay, so that's his view. Quite naturally, later centuries witnessed the growth of a number of legends explaining the appearance of the first Christians, the most beautiful being the charming medieval tale of Joseph of Arimathea and his companions. The famous Glastonbury thorn tree, miraculously springing from Joseph's staff, supposedly marked the spot where his company ended their journey to the Holy Land. However fanciful the legend may be, it does bear witness to the antiquity of a Christian settlement at Glastonbury. Here in the southwestern part of England were perhaps the first witnesses to the faith of Jesus Christ by 200 AD. There is clear evidence of a community of Christians in Britain. Okay, by 200 AD, clear evidence of a community of Christians in Britain. As yet neither large nor strong, but nonetheless, as later events, firmly rooted among the people. Okay, so in this book, what he's doing is he's just saying it because he's, in England speaking about British history. Okay. Now, some of these I've not gotten into detail with at this moment, but I will say that, we do have this early church tradition. But as it is talked about in Albion Restored, the tradition of Joseph Arimathea is not as strong in the regular churches as it was in the tin trade. So ancient British miners, especially the Welsh, would go on, and I did make this wrong. It was southwest and not southeast. Okay. So Cornwall and Somerset, they're more in the southwest corner. Nevertheless, the uh, the Tinsmen, they talked about a lot of legends of Joseph Arimathea and how his hair was long and how Jesus was a teenager and Joseph marched around here and they set up God's kingdom out there. So we do have those, but they were actually from tin miners. And the tin miners had Phoenicians working with them as they mined their tin. Well, we also find in that book, now the Phoenicians, there's YouTube documentaries and all sorts of things connecting the Phoenicians to that area. But they talk about here several linguistic keys that have Hebrew words in the ancient Old English. And I might be wrong on that. It might not be English at this point. It's probably an ancient Celtic. But there were similarities in the hieroglyphics of these ancient British and, this is where you get the Stonehenge types, okay? But their hieroglyphics were very similar in lettering, which is very important if you're using hieroglyphics, to the Egyptians, okay? But yet, some of the words that were written in these ancient documents use Hebrew words, okay? And then, of course, when the English kind of started to develop a little bit more, they would talk about the Jewish hut or the Jewish stick, the specific tools that the Jews themselves would use when they mined, okay, what their preference was in mining, and, how their culture worked. So the Jews have a strong influence in the southwest England. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, we know that he's got tales of being in that area, but we've learned other things. Arimathea, we don't hear that much because it's what we call a Greekism. But in Hebrew, okay, so a Greekism is that Greek accent put upon a word, okay? So I'm Matthew, but in Spanish I'm Mateo, okay? So the Greekism is upon that word, but it probably was in Hebrew, Ramathea, which was a town, I believe in Ephraim. Now, Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And that's very important because Joseph, number one, he was that son of Jacob who had gifts and talents dealing with the non-Jewish people. And of course, he proved that in Egypt as he ascended the ranks from a slave to maybe a second in command in that ancient empire. Well, his descendants would also be gifted, and the Ephraimites were the mightiest of the tribal armies. So in Ramathea, the mountain, which I believe, I could be wrong on this one, but I believe that Shiloh was around Ramathea. You had a people group that was ready to minister to the world. And I think I found in my studies connections to the Davidic tabernacle. Okay, and you just have to go through dealing with Christ. All right, so long story short, Joseph Arimathea is the one who witnessed the corpse of Christ. And he would be the owner of what we today call the Shroud of Turin. And the ancient mythology said that he was going up and down from France to England, okay, making these excursions to buy and sell the trade of tin and probably some other materials. Well, as he's going up and down there, they said that he had the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail was a container And some dispute whether it was a literal cup. That's important. But that it contained the blood of Christ, which led to immortality. And it's also well known that the Shroud of Turin was originally an ancient Jewish tablecloth, which is commonly what they used when they buried the dead. Is they would take the long tablecloth and use it to help in a process of mummifying the dead. So he had that Jewish table. Of course, we know that there was a rich man who's anonymous who provided for Jesus to have a table in which they would perform the Lord's Supper. Could that rich man be the same rich man, Joseph Arimathea, who was a secret disciple of Christ? Not an Orthodox Christian. He didn't stick around to, what was it? He wasn't an Orthodox Christian, so he didn't stick around to, learn from the Apostle Paul, for instance. But around the destruction of the temple time, Joseph Arimathea was one of the family members. According to these tales, he was the uncle of Mary, which would make him the great uncle of Jesus. Now, I had a great uncle who was only 6 years older than my mother. So I know that it is possible to have great aunts and uncles in close proximity, age-wise. So Joseph Arimathea in the Gospels, he hung around the family of Jesus Christ when Jesus was being crucified. In the Gospels, it says that Joseph Arimathea made his own tomb and he hewn out the rock to make his tomb. Well, why would a rich man make their own tomb unless they were very good at it? Well, if he was a miner, he would be very good at carving out caves and therefore making a tomb for himself, which of course he donated to Christ. There are connections with other archaeological artifacts. You have the Garden Tomb. Now, there's two tombs for competition. The Holy Sepulchre, which was found underneath the pagan king Hadrian's tomb and recognized by Constantine's mother as the original place. However, the whole area was laid waste, so it's easy to get confused. They have no real archaeological proof that the Holy Sepulchre was Jesus' tomb, other than testimony of, popular Catholics. So, the Garden Tomb, also known as Gordon's Tomb, had a lot of clues that would make it the original place. There is a giant cistern underneath the garden. So it was the third biggest cistern in the city of Jerusalem. So it demands that a wealthy person own that area. It was just around the corner from a very odd-looking rock structure, which is now today known as Skull Hill. The rock structure was an area that was quarried out by King Solomon and used for the temple. It is just down the hill from the top where Jesus was crucified, and the top is known as Mount Moriah, where Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac until God provided. There's also a door that's missing from the area, and we have since found a giant disc-shaped stone called the Great Stone of Mount Nebo. In the Gospel of Mark, the stone in front of the tomb was not simply a regular-sized stone, it would be about 1,000 pounds, but it was a giant stone. And this stone was a very long diameter, about 9.5 feet. The width of it was very thin. It was about um, 15 inches. There is a trench in front of the garden tomb that is 15 and then eventually 18 inches. There is a spot where a spike was nailed into the tomb, and there is a hole with iron inside of the great stone of Mount Nebo. In the tomb, there is a, a laying place for the corpse that was 5 foot 8 inches. But then there are 2 to 3 inches more carved into the structure. And you can tell so because it's only so tall. It's just this little area, just like carved there, as if maybe the other body is tall and so they adjusted it when they buried it. Well, the Shroud of Turin has a corpse that has been estimated to be about 5, 10, or 11 inches. So that would be those extra inches grooved in. There is also now found a face cloth. They call it the Sudarium of Oviedo. And this cloth is much older than the shroud, it's much older than the shroud. It has signs of bloody wounds. And there's about 114 of these cuts. And in the Shroud of Turin, the head has about 114 cuts. So this matches the shroud. So the shroud was carried in a copper canister, and the shroud would have the blood of Christ stained on it. And Joseph would have been the owner. And there is a forged painting called the Mandy Lion that looks like that. It came from Asia Minor or Turkey. And Asia Minor would have had a port where Joseph of Arimathea would stop by. So perhaps Joseph of Arimathea showed off the shroud. They made a painting, and that would be the key to later icons painted of Jesus Christ. Meanwhile, they talk about this shroud. The shroud ends up in a bizarre place, 10, 15 miles away from the Seine River. The Seine River, a river in France, would cut through the early part of France and exit Paris. And just 10 or 15 miles away from the river, there was an itty bitty teeny weeny little village where they first record the existence of the Shroud of Turin. And they put it upon I think it was a Templar Knight from Asia Minor. Why would he go to this little town? Maybe he did research about the Mandy Lion and came there, and instead of bringing the shroud there, maybe he found the shroud there. The Catholics were very awkward about the shroud. They were not quick to make it a big deal because they had a lot of these relics, lots of relics, and they would rank them much higher in price. But yet this thing was just there. The Catholics also feel weird about Glastonbury. They eventually accepted it in, but really wasn't theirs initially. There were these Christians called the Chaldees, and Joseph Arimathea would, according to legend, he frequented there. He planted the Glastonbury thorn tree there. In the 1500s, they burnt that down because they felt like it had become an idol. but yet it produced other thorn trees. And only in Glastonbury was there a thorn tree or thorn trees in all of Britain. Yet they found these thorn trees coming from that Syria Palestinian area. So you have this archaeology setting up for the facts of Joseph of Arimathea being real. Maybe all these knights of Arthurian legend that also include Joseph of Arimathea in genealogies and other things like that, perhaps there's smoke because there was fire. So, taking that into account, we have Joseph of Arimathea, an ancient witness to Jesus and his resurrection, and maybe even a teenage Jesus who he squired. Okay, a squire is a teenage boy who trains in an occupation. Maybe Joseph, his father, died, and then he was sent to be a squire to his uncle. When he gets back for his baptism under John, John doesn't even recognize his first cousin. Maybe Jesus was gone so long, but also, if he was away in a northern territory, maybe he wasn't as tan as everybody else was. Maybe he looked just a little bit different where he wasn't very familiar. And Joseph Arimathea, maybe he was not simply a religious Sanhedrin guy, but from some Greek research, perhaps he was a merchant guy, and he provided Jerusalem with a lot of money, which is why Pontius Pilate even considered listening to him about rights to the body, because it is encoded in law that only the family has a right to the body. Okay, so that is the first set of evidence that people are not getting these days. Okay, now, so we have evidence of James, we have evidence of Joseph of Arimathea, we got evidence from the Apostle Paul and the resurrection, but I might save that a little bit later because we're going to end up making a separate case for the resurrection. Oh yeah, and the King James is called a counselor. The Joseph of Arimathea was a counselor, and that's in Luke 23:50. Okay, so now let me hit some of the usual suspects, so I can get there. Oh yeah, the Tarshish. It's also mentioned in the prophets. Skimming across. Because a lot of this is so interesting, I memorized it, so I just went with that. So, Celsus is a fellow who Origen would reportedly argue with, who was a skeptic of Jesus. He was a heathen, and he thought that Jesus was a sorcerer, which would make him some form of supernatural. Then we also have a guy named Pelagian. And Pelagian reports, let's see here, a little bit. I'm going to try to find an important point. This is as if against his will expressed his opinion that the doctrine taught by the fathers of our system were not devoid of divine power. Okay. Okay, I'm going to do the whole quote. Now, Pelagian, in the 13th and 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of the future events, although falling into confusion about some things, which refer to Peter as if they were Jesus. So, Pelagian kind of has some record of this. He heard something. He's not the perfect witness, but he is giving an independent record. So he's heard about Jesus. And then Hadrian also reports of Jesus. Suetonius says, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the investigation of Christus, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So they've heard of Jesus. They don't have a perfect record of him. They've heard this stuff going on in the first century. Punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to news and mischievous superstitions. And that's in the Lives of the Caesar. I think that's also, okay, that's also Suetonius. Tacitus, he talks about Nero and the Christians. He says, and I'm going to cut short here. This is Nero fastened the guilt in conflict, the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called the Christians by the populace. Crassus, from whom the name had origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So, there's a clear record that this is a historical fact, and Tacitus is recording this as histories. I give some other background information. The Jews in the Talmud record Jesus. They don't have a lot of good to say about him, but that makes it more historical because they have to deal with the history of this guy. So Jesus the Nazarene practiced magic and deceived and led Israel astray. Second time, this is a person, and he has a supernatural reputation. And he died on the cross. All right. There's many other references in the Talmud. Pliny the Younger. Let's see here. All right. He was torturing people who would name Christ, or he was recording this. He says others who were named by the anonymous informer at first confessed themselves Christians and then denied it. True, they said they had been of that persuasion, but they had quitted it, some 3 years, others many years, and a few as much as 25 years previously. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in habit of meeting a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternative verses a hymn to Christ as to a god. So the Christians early on had recognized the deity of Christ. Josephus is famous. He recorded the Jewish history, which helps out because the temple was destroyed. But he wrote to the Romans and he wrote in Latin. And he recorded all these things. And so there are several statements about John the Baptist and James and Jesus himself. And one which is intolerable because it just says that Jesus, worked miracles and he was, killed and then he rose again and that he was a miraculous person and the Messiah. They're like, this is too much. Obviously, a Christian added this. But what they forget is in that first and second century, it was not a crime to believe that someone was Messiah. As I said, they let that happen 30 times unless they rebelled against Rome. Then they were killed. So Josephus doesn't confess that Jesus is God, but he talks about Jesus and how miraculous he was, and that, it seems like this guy's the Messiah. Well, wouldn't he be seeming like he's the Messiah if he had performed all those miracles and rose from the dead? Yeah. So, let's see here. I guess that's good right there as far as our studies, because now we know that Jesus really is a historical person. And if we're going to talk about a historical person, then we might want to look at the most used historical records, and those are the Gospels. Later, there is going to be talk about the there is a synthesized document of a gospel which was, recognized by scholars as a later edition, not the first. So these four different books, Luke, Mark, John, Matthew, why are they writing a story of Jesus Christ separately? We'll address that. We'll address accusations of mythology in the next installment.